The thermometer on the porch read 20 below, and there was no truck coming up that holler. No plow, no power line. Just a wood stove, a root cellar, and whatever a family had put up since August. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Those families didn't just survive that kind of cold. They ate well. Hot, dense, fat-laden meals built specifically to keep a body burning through a night when the windows iced shut on the inside. This was not poverty food. This was a system, perfected over generations, for staying alive when nothing else would come to help you. We lost it on purpose. Tonight we get 25 pieces of it back. Number 25. Soup beans. Every kitchen in eastern Kentucky had a pot of pintos going from morning till dark, simmered low on the back of the wood stove where the heat never really stopped, the lid rattling soft against the steam. A nickel bought a pound of dried beans in 1933, and that pound, with a little fatback and salt, fed a family of 5 through a whole evening, sometimes 2. The smell filled the cabin before the lamps were even lit, thick and earthy, clinging to the quilts. Grandma just called it supper. It was actually the floor the whole winter stood on, the one thing that was always there, no matter how bad the week had been. Number 24. Salt-risen bread. No commercial yeast came up these hollows in the 1930s. Yeast cost money, and money didn't come easy in a coal camp or a tobacco patch. So women made their own, fermenting cornmeal and flour in warm milk near the stove until it bubbled and turned sharp, almost cheesy in smell, the whole kitchen carrying that strange sour tang for hours. That was wild fermentation doing its work, the same science bakeries pay extra for today, bottled and sold as sourdough culture. The loaf came out dense, tangy, with a crust that cracked when you broke it. That is not progress, losing a bread that fed itself. Number 23. Hog jowl boiled with greens. After hog-killing time, nothing went to waste, and the jowl, salted and hung in the smokehouse, became the fat that carried a family through January and February. Boiled slow with whatever greens had survived the frost, it rendered down into something rich and almost sweet, the fat clinging to every leaf, the broth turning a deep amber. In a one-room cabin with a single stove, fat wasn't indulgence. It was fuel, the kind of dense, slow-burning energy a body needed just to stay warm through an unheated bedroom and a morning walk to the well. Number 22. Leather breeches. Come autumn, green beans were strung whole on long threads of twine using a darning needle and hung from cabin rafters to dry. No jars, no lids, no sugar needed for preserving, just air and time. By winter they'd shriveled dark and tough, like leather, swaying a little whenever the door opened. A pot of water and a little meat brought them back to life, soft and smoky tasting from weeks near the wood smoke. Today they're sold online as heirloom dried beans for $9 a bag, photographed in linen. Grandma just called it Tuesday, number 21. Cracklin' cornbread. When the hog was rendered for lard, the crisp bits of skin left behind, cracklins, went straight into the cornbread batter, popping faintly as the skillet hit the heat. The result was cornbread with a crunch running through it, salty and rich, baked in a black skillet that had been seasoned for 30 years and never washed with soap. A family of 5 could eat on one skillet of this for 2 meals, maybe stretched to 3 with buttermilk poured over the crumbs. Every calorie in it was doing a job, keeping hands warm enough to still hold a hoe by February. Number 20. Sulfur and molasses tonic. Every spring, and sometimes through the worst stretch of winter, children got a spoonful of sorghum molasses mixed with a pinch of sulfur, straight off the spoon, first thing in the morning before anyone had eaten. It tasted like burnt sugar with something faintly metallic underneath, and you didn't argue about it. Molasses carries real iron, real trace minerals, the kind a growing body needed in a season with almost no fresh produce, the kind Grandma knew about long before anyone printed it on a label. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 19. Killed lettuce. In late winter, when the garden gave almost nothing, a few hardy things survived under straw. Mustard greens, kale, the toughest leaf lettuce, frostbitten but alive. Grandma would pick what she could find, wash it in cold well water, and pile it in a bowl. Then came the part that gave the dish its name. Bacon grease, hot enough to spit, poured straight over the cold leaves. The sound was instant. A sharp hiss, a curl of steam rising off the bowl, the leaves wilting and darkening in seconds, turning glossy and tender under the heat. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. This wasn't a salad. Salads were for people with money for olive oil and lemons shipped up from somewhere warm. This was hot fat doing the work cold oil couldn't. A splash of vinegar went on after, cutting through the richness, and the whole thing was eaten warm, almost steaming, on a plate next to cornbread. It used what was there. It used what would otherwise have frozen solid and gone to nothing. Today, restaurants in cities plate this exact same idea, wilted greens, warm bacon vinaigrette, and charge $16 for it, with a poached egg on top and a sprig of something green for color. Grandma just called it killed lettuce. There was nothing fancy about it, and there was nothing missing from it either. It was a full meal made from the last green thing standing in a frozen garden, and it tasted like the difference between giving up and not. Number 18. Apple stack cake. This one didn't belong to any single kitchen. It belonged to the whole holler. When a wedding or a homecoming was coming, word went out, and women up and down the creek each baked one thin layer, a single round, no more than half an inch thick, made from a stiff dough sweetened with sorghum, baked hard enough to keep for days. Each woman brought her layer to the gathering, and there, on the kitchen table, the cake was built, layer after layer, spread thick with stewed dried apples between each one, the fruit dark and spiced and soft from soaking overnight. By morning, the cake had to sit overnight before serving. That was the rule, non-negotiable. The apple filling slowly softening those hard layers until the whole thing could be cut with a fork, each bite tasting faintly different depending on whose layer it came from. Some families judged a woman's worth at a gathering by how many layers she could contribute over the years. This was not a dessert. This was a record of who showed up, who could still bake, who was still alive to bring a layer this year. A cake built from a dozen kitchens at once, eaten slow, the dried apples carrying the only sweetness most of these families would taste between harvest and spring. Nobody calls it anything else now. Nobody calls it anything at all. Number 17. Buttermilk and crumbled cornbread. Some nights there wasn't time, or there wasn't wood enough to spare to cook a full supper. So a glass came out, a tall one, and into it went a chunk of yesterday's cornbread, crumbled by hand into rough pieces, and then buttermilk poured over the top until the cornbread floated, then slowly sank, soaking up the tang of the milk as it went soft. You ate it with a spoon, the cornbread turning to something between bread and pudding, cool and sour, and filling in a way that didn't make sense until you'd had it. Buttermilk was free, a byproduct of churning butter, the thin liquid left behind that most people today would pour down the drain without a second thought. Pouring it out would have seemed insane to a woman in 1934. That was supper for tonight. This is not progress. The idea that buttermilk is waste. In the 1930s, it was one of the only fermented dairy products most rural families ate regularly, and fermented dairy does things for digestion that science only properly mapped out decades later. Grandma didn't need a study. She had a glass, a spoon, and a chunk of cornbread, and on a cold night, with the stove banked low and everyone too tired to cook, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly right. Number 16. Smoked sausage hung in the smokehouse rafters. Once a year, usually in the first hard cold of November or December, the hog was killed, and what came out of that one animal had to last. Not weeks, but months. Sausage, ground from the trimmings and seasoned heavy with sage and black pepper, was packed into casings and hung from the rafters of a small smokehouse out back, where a slow fire of hickory or apple wood smoldered for days. The smell got into everything: your coat, your hair, the inside of the cabin when the wind blew the wrong way. And it worked. Salt pulled the moisture out, smoke laid down a barrier no bacteria could cross, and a sausage hung in October could still be cut down, sliced and fried in February, the fat crackling in the pan, the meat dark red-brown all the way through. This was preservation science, full stop. Centuries old, refined by people who had never heard the word bacteria but understood exactly what it did. One hog, properly smoked and cured, fed a family of 5 through an entire winter without a single hour of electricity. Today, the same product, smoked, cured, hung the old way, sells in specialty shops for $22 a pound, marketed as artisan. Grandma just called it meat that would keep. They knew things about preserving food that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 15. Shuck beans. Late in the season, when green beans were coming in faster than anyone could eat or can them, women strung the surplus on thread, much like leather breeches, but these were left to ferment slightly before fully drying, picking up a sour, almost wine-like edge as natural bacteria worked on the sugars in the pod. Hung in a dry spot, often near the chimney where the air stayed warm, they shrank down to dark, twisted strips that smelled faintly fermented even before cooking. Come winter, a handful went into a pot with water and a piece of salt meat, simmering for hours until the beans softened and the broth turned cloudy and rich, carrying that distinctive tang that set shuck beans apart from any other bean dish on the table. Families argued about whose shuck beans were best the way some families argue about barbecue now, and the answer always came down to how the beans had been dried and how long they'd fermented before the string went up. This was fermentation, plain and real, the same biological process behind kimchi and sauerkraut, happening quietly in an Appalachian cabin with no name for it beyond the way Mama did it. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Fermented foods preserve nutrients that cooking alone destroys. Grandma just called it shuck beans. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 14. Fried mush, cornmeal mush, a thick porridge of cornmeal cooked slow in water or milk until it thickened, was breakfast more mornings than not. A big pot of it made the night before and left to set, cooling into a dense, sliceable loaf by morning. And that was the real genius of it. What didn't get eaten hot, soft, and steaming the night before became something else entirely by sunrise. Sliced into thick pieces and fried in a little bacon grease until the outside turned golden and crisp while the inside stayed soft and dense, fried mush was breakfast, lunch, sometimes both, drizzled with sorghum or eaten plain, the crust crackling slightly under a fork. Nothing wasted. That was the entire principle. A pot of cornmeal, costing about 3 cents a pound in the early 1930s, became 2 completely different meals across 2 days, one soft and one crisp, one supper and one breakfast. Today, the exact same idea. Cornmeal cooked into a thick porridge, cooled, sliced, and fried, shows up on menus as polenta cakes, served with a drizzle of honey or a fried egg, for $13 a plate. This was not polenta. This was leftover mush, and it fed a family for 2 meals out of one pot. That is not innovation. That is something we already had, sold back to us with a different name, number 13. Possum and sweet potatoes. When the snow lay deep enough to track an animal clearly, and when there was nothing left in the smokehouse, men went out with dogs and lanterns, checking trap lines that ran along the creek bank and up into the timber. A possum, trapped in a hard winter, was fat, genuinely fat, having spent the fall eating persimmons and whatever else it could find, and that fat mattered as much as the meat itself, cleaned, parboiled to cut the gaminess, then roasted slow in a Dutch oven set right into the coals of the fireplace. The possum cooked alongside sweet potatoes pulled from the root cellar, where they'd been packed in dry sand since October to keep them from rotting or freezing. The sweet potatoes softened and caramelized in the rendered fat, turning dark at the edges, sweet and slightly smoky. There's no romance to add here, and none is needed. This was practical winter protein, available when almost nothing else was, harvested by people who knew the land well enough to find food on it, even buried under a foot of snow. A possum and a few sweet potatoes could feed a family for a day when the alternative was going without. Nobody apologized for it. Nobody pretended it was anything other than what it was: a meal found, cooked, and eaten, the way people had been doing in these hills for longer than anyone could remember. Number 12. Pickled beets and eggs, down in the root cellar, dug into the hillside itself, cool and dark and smelling of earth. Rows of mason jars lined the shelves, and among them the deepest, most startling color in the whole cellar: pickled beets, a red so dark it looked almost black in the dim light of a lantern, with hard-boiled eggs submerged inside. Turning a deep magenta all the way through after a week or two in the brine, beets from the garden cost almost nothing, pennies a pound, grown in soil that didn't need much else. Boiled, peeled, sliced, and packed into jars with vinegar, sugar, and a few spices, they kept through the entire winter without any refrigeration at all, the vinegar doing the preserving the way it had for thousands of years before anyone called it food science. Pulling a jar of these up from the cellar in January was its own small ceremony. The lid stuck, the smell of vinegar and clove rising up as it finally popped open, the beets cold and sharp and impossibly bright against a plate of beans and cornbread. The eggs, having soaked up that color and tang, were often saved for Sunday, sliced into wedges that looked like something out of a stained glass window. Color, in a winter where everything outside was gray and brown and white, mattered more than people now would ever think to admit. Number 11. Hot water cornbread. Not every cabin had an oven. Many had only a single cook stove, or in the oldest homes, just an open fireplace with a flat stone or a cast iron skillet set near the coals. For those families, the cornbread that worked, the only cornbread that worked, was hot water cornbread made by stirring boiling water directly into cornmeal and salt until it formed a thick, sticky paste, then shaping it by hand into rough ovals. Each one went into a skillet with hot grease, where it fried rather than baked, the outside turning dark and crisp almost immediately, while the inside stayed dense and slightly chewy, tasting purely of corn with nothing to soften it: no sugar, no buttermilk, no eggs. Just cornmeal, water, salt, and heat. This was cornbread reduced to its absolute essentials. Born entirely out of necessity, a family with one heat source and no oven still needed bread, and this is what they made. The sound of it hitting hot grease, the hiss and immediate crackle, was a sound repeated daily in thousands of cabins across these hills. It cost almost nothing. Cornmeal at 3 cents a pound stretched across a week of breakfasts, and it asked for nothing in return except a hot skillet and a few minutes. That is not deprivation. That is ingenuity, distilled down to 4 ingredients and a sound. Number 10. Souse meat, after the hog was butchered, certain parts didn't go into sausage or get hung for smoking. The head, the feet, the skin scraps, parts that most people today wouldn't even recognize as food. These went into a big pot and simmered for hours, sometimes most of a full day, until the meat fell away from bone, and the connective tissue broke down completely into the broth itself. Once cooled slightly, the meat was picked out, chopped fine, seasoned heavy with black pepper, sage, and a little vinegar or hot pepper, then packed into pans or crocks along with some of that gelatin-rich broth. Left to sit in a cool spot, the spring house usually, or just a windowsill in deep winter, it set up firm, almost like a savory jelly, sliceable into thick wedges, Souse meat was sliced cold and eaten on bread or fried in a skillet until the edges crisped. Nothing about the hog went unused. Not the head, not the feet, not the skin. Every part had a destination, and every destination fed someone. Today, restaurants serve nearly the same preparation. Meat cooked down, set in gelatin, sliced, and call it terrine, charging $19 a plate for what was once simply the parts nobody wanted to throw away. Grandma just called it not wasting the hog. Number 9. Apple butter, cooked outdoors in a copper kettle. Once a year, usually in late September or early October, families gathered, sometimes several families together, around a massive copper kettle set over an open fire in someone's yard. Into it went bushels of apples, peeled and cored by hand over the course of an entire morning, dozens of people working at once, peelings piling up in heaps for the hogs. The apples cooked down slowly over the open fire for hours, sometimes all day, someone always stirring with a long wooden paddle to keep the bottom from scorching, the mixture gradually turning from pale applesauce to a deep, dark reddish brown, the smell of cinnamon and cooking apples carrying for what felt like miles on a cool fall day. By evening, what had started as bushels of whole apples had reduced down to a thick, spreadable butter packed hot into jars that sealed themselves as they cooled. This was a community event as much as a preservation method. Neighbors working together for a shared result, each family going home with jars that would sweeten biscuits and cornbread all winter long. In a season with almost no other source of sweetness beyond sorghum, apple butter was treasured, doled out carefully, a spoonful at a time. It represented an entire day of communal labor distilled into something that would last for months, sweetness, stored against the cold, made by hands working together. Number 8. Pawpaw preserves. Along the river bottoms and creek banks of eastern Kentucky, in the late summer, a strange fruit ripened on small understory trees. Pawpaws with a custardy, tropical-tasting flesh that seemed completely out of place in Appalachia, somewhere between a banana and a mango, with large, dark seeds running through soft yellow pulp. Pawpaws didn't keep well fresh. They bruised easily and turned within days. So families who found a productive tree worked quickly, scooping out the pulp and cooking it down with a little sugar into a preserve that could be put up in jars, the flavor concentrating into something even richer and more tropical than the fresh fruit itself. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Pawpaws contain more vitamin C and significantly more potassium than either bananas or oranges, packed into a fruit that grows wild, for free, in places most people now drive past without a second glance. This was a fruit that simply vanished from American memory almost entirely, eclipsed by fruits that could survive shipping and sit on a shelf. Today, a handful of farm markets and upscale ice cream shops have rediscovered it, selling pawpaw ice cream for $8 a scoop as some kind of exotic novelty. It was never exotic. It was just growing along the creek the whole time. This is where the story turns, because the foods themselves were never the whole picture. Foraging, knowing where the ramps came up first in spring, which trees held pawpaws, which roots could be dug for tea, was knowledge passed down through families, walked into children before they could read. And through the 1930s and into the 1940s, as coal companies expanded their hold on these same hollows, that knowledge became something the companies actively worked against. Company towns operated on a simple system. Miners were paid in scrip, a currency good only at the company-owned commissary, where prices ran higher than cash stores in town, sometimes significantly so. Families who had once fed themselves from gardens, root cellars, smokehouses, and the woods around them were pushed, generation by generation, toward dependency on that commissary, toward buying canned goods and white flour with scrip that could be spent nowhere else, while the land that had fed their grandparents sat right outside the door, increasingly unused, increasingly forgotten. This was not an accident of modernization. This was a deliberate economic structure designed to convert self-sufficient families into a captive market, one paycheck, one piece of scrip at a time. The knowledge of how to live off that land, refined over generations specifically to survive winters like the ones in this video, was the first casualty. That is not progress. That is a theft so quiet, most families never knew exactly when it happened. Number 7. Ramps, wild onions fried with eggs. By March, after months of cornmeal, beans, and whatever had survived in the root cellar, something happened in the high hollows that families waited for all winter. Ramps came up, wild leeks pushing through the last of the snow and dead leaves, their broad green leaves and white bulbs carrying a smell so strong, so pungently garlic and onion, that you could smell a patch of them from yards away before you ever saw them, dug by the basketful. Ramps were chopped and fried with eggs, the smell filling the cabin and clinging to clothes and hair for days afterward. A smell so distinctive that children showing up to school in April with ramps on their breath was simply expected, a known seasonal marker as reliable as the calendar itself. But ramps meant more than flavor. They were the first fresh green food after months without one. A literal nutritional and psychological turning point, the taste of winter actually ending. Today, ramp festivals draw crowds, and city restaurants serve ramp dishes for $24 a plate during their brief spring window, treating them as a delicacy. For families in these hollows, ramps were never a delicacy. They were relief, the smell of survival, finally giving way to spring. Number 7. Ramps. Wild onions fried with eggs. By March, after months of cornmeal, beans, and whatever had survived in the root cellar, something happened in the high hollows that families waited for all winter. Ramps came up, wild leeks pushing through the last of the snow and dead leaves, their broad green leaves and white bulbs carrying a smell so strong, so pungently garlic and onion, that you could smell a patch of them from yards away before you ever saw them. Dug by the basketful, ramps were chopped and fried with eggs, the smell filling the cabin and clinging to clothes and hair for days afterward. A smell so distinctive that children showing up to school in April with ramps on their breath was simply expected. A known seasonal marker as reliable as the calendar itself. But ramps meant more than flavor. They were the first fresh green food after months without one. A literal nutritional and psychological turning point, the taste of winter actually ending. Today, ramp festivals draw crowds, and city restaurants serve ramp dishes for $24 a plate during their brief spring window, treating them as a delicacy. For families in these hollows, ramps were never a delicacy. They were relief, the smell of survival finally giving way to spring. Number 6. Gritted bread in late summer, when field corn was still too young to dry on the stalk, but had filled out enough to be useful. Families made gritted bread. Corn grated fresh off the cob, using a homemade grater, often just a flattened tin punched full of holes and nailed to a board, the kernels scraped down into a rough, milky pulp. The sound of it was unmistakable, a steady, rhythmic scraping that carried through an open cabin door on an August evening, often done by whoever was too young or too old for heavier garden work, sitting on the porch with a bowl between their knees. That pulp mixed with a little flour, salt, and a touch of sugar, was poured into a hot greased skillet and cooked like a thick pancake, the edges crisping while the inside stayed moist and slightly sweet, tasting unmistakably of fresh corn in a way dried cornmeal never quite matched. Gritted bread existed in a narrow window. Only a few weeks each year, when the corn was at exactly the right stage, and families who had lived through hard winters understood it as something almost like a celebration, a brief return of fresh-tasting food after a long stretch of stored and dried things. The scraping sound, repeated evening after evening for those few weeks, was the sound of late summer itself in these hollows. Number 5. Dried pumpkin and squash strips, hung from the rafters, alongside leather breeches and shuck beans. Another preservation method filled cabin rafters in the fall. Pumpkin and squash, peeled, sliced into long strips, and hung to dry near the chimney, where rising heat slowly drew the moisture out over several weeks, the strips curling and darkening from bright orange to a deep amber brown. By the time winter arrived, these strips had shrunk to a fraction of their original size, leathery and lightweight, taking up almost no storage space compared to the whole squash they'd come from. A critical advantage in a one-room cabin where every bit of space mattered. Rehydrated in water or milk, the strips swelled back up and could be mashed, sweetened with sorghum, and baked into pies, or simply simmered as a side dish alongside beans and cornbread. This was again preservation requiring no jars, no sugar in large quantities, no equipment beyond rafters and time. Just the same principle running through nearly every food in this video, the conversion of a perishable harvest into something that could wait patiently through months of cold for the moment it was needed. A pumpkin that would have rotted by November became pie filling in February. Nothing about that required electricity. It required only knowing how and the patience to wait. Number 4. Sassafras tea. In late winter, when colds and the general heaviness of months indoors set in, families dug sassafras roots, a small understory tree common throughout eastern Kentucky, its roots carrying a distinctive reddish color and a smell instantly recognizable to anyone who grew up with it. Somewhere between root beer and cinnamon, warm and slightly sweet even before sugar was added. The roots were scrubbed, cut into pieces, and boiled, the water slowly turning a deep pinkish red, the smell filling the cabin in a way that felt almost medicinal and comforting at once. Sassafras tea was considered a blood thinner, a tonic for the sluggish feeling of deep winter, taken hot, sometimes with a little sorghum stirred in. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Sassafras root contains a compound called safrole, and in 1960, the FDA banned safrole as a food additive over cancer concerns identified in animal studies, effectively ending commercial sassafras tea and root beer flavored with real sassafras root. That's real regulatory history. And it's also why an entire category of homemade tonic simply vanished from store shelves within a generation. Not because families stopped wanting it, but because the ingredient itself was reclassified, and the knowledge of how to use it carefully, in moderation, the way it always had been, went with it. Number 3. Half-runner beans and streaked meat. The Sunday pot, 6 days a week, the bean pot held pintos, the everyday bean. But on Sunday, if the garden had produced well that year, half-runner beans went in instead. A different variety, flatter, with a slightly different texture and flavor that families considered special, almost ceremonial, even though to an outside eye they looked nearly identical to any other bean. What made Sunday different wasn't really the bean, though. It was the meat. Streaked meat, fatty, lean streaked bacon, costing about 8 cents a pound when it could be bought at all, went into the pot in a larger piece than during the week, visible chunks of it floating among the beans rather than just flavoring the broth from a small piece simmered and removed. For families who saw meat in small amounts most days, or some days not at all, Sunday dinner meant meat you could actually see and pick out with a fork, a visible marker that this day was different, even if the underlying meal was, structurally, the same beans and cornbread that had been eaten all week. That distinction mattered enormously. It was dignity, served in a bowl, the difference between a week that had been hard and a Sunday that, for one meal, looked a little like plenty. Number 2. Cathead biscuits with sorghum molasses stained for their size, large, irregular, roughly the size of a cat's head, with none of the dainty uniformity of a biscuit cutter. These biscuits were made by hand, torn off in rough portions from a mound of dough mixed with lard, buttermilk, and flour, then baked in a hot oven or skillet until the outsides turned deep golden brown, and the insides stayed soft, almost fluffy. Despite their rough shape, a single cathead biscuit, split open while still hot enough to melt a pat of lard pressed into the center, was substantial, dense with fat and flour, built deliberately to carry a body through hours of hard morning work before the next meal. Sorghum molasses, dark and thick, poured slowly over a split biscuit, ran into every crack and crevice, the bitter-sweet flavor cutting through the richness of the lard. The caloric math here was simple and deliberate. Fat and flour in large quantities, eaten first thing in the morning before field work, or a long walk through snow to a one-room schoolhouse. Today, bakeries in cities sell what they call biscuit bars, charging $6 for a single biscuit, roughly the size these were made by default, with a drizzle of honey standing in for sorghum. Grandma just called it breakfast. It was breakfast built like fuel, because that's exactly what it was. Number 1. Cushaw pie. The cushaw was a strange-looking squash, long, curved, pale green with darker stripes, more like something from a different climate entirely than a typical pumpkin. It grew easily in eastern Kentucky gardens, often without much tending at all, and by late fall families had several sitting in the root cellar, waiting. Cushaw pie was the pie of these hollows, not pumpkin, never pumpkin, though to anyone tasting it for the first time the difference might seem subtle. The Cushaw's flesh, baked down and mashed, had a slightly different texture, a little less stringy, and the pies made from it carried the same warm spice combination: cinnamon, nutmeg, a little ginger if it could be afforded, that filled a one-room cabin with a smell that meant something specific. It meant the year had been survived. The harvest was in. The hard months ahead had been prepared for, as much as they could be. A cushaw pie cooling on a window sill in November was not just dessert. It was a marker, the closing of one cycle and the beginning of another, made from a squash that cost nothing, sweetened with what little sugar or sorghum could be spared, and shared, usually among everyone in the house, because there was finally, briefly, something to share that wasn't strictly necessary. That is not a small thing. That is everything.